Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. My name is Suan Sonna, and today I'm here to start a new series called ApologeticsBytes. Basically, people have asked me for a while if I'd be willing to make shorter content, maybe in the form of YouTube shorts or Instagram reels, but I've always felt kind of uncomfortable with that because oftentimes making shorter content requires a compromise in quality, in rigor, in sophistication, in nuance. And so I never really wanted to make it over to things like TikTok and other platforms of the sort. But I actually came to a realization more recently that, there are certain topics that I think I can responsibly, adequately cover within a span of 10 minutes or less. And so today is going to be that first experiment, and I have my timer here to make sure that I stay on target. So here we go. I want to talk about in this first apologetics bite how anti-Catholicism actually played into Catholicism's hand. I'm interested in this topic because, as many of you might know, the Cooperative election study at Harvard released some recent data that there are now more Catholic Gen Z than Protestant Gen Z in America. The numbers, if I recall, were 19% Protestant Gen Z, 21% Catholic Gen Z. We also know in the United Kingdom that there are more Catholic youth than Anglican youth over there. And throughout the country, we hear stories about giant OCA classes of college students being driven into the Catholic Church, just all kinds of positive, encouraging stories about just this revived interest in Catholicism. So the question is, what caused this giant surge in Catholicism? What has caused Protestant apologists to have conferences now talking about why they're Protestant, or even articles on the Gospel Coalition saying things like, Roman Catholic apologetics is surging online. Their intended audience, Protestants. So I think part of the explanation is anti-Catholicism, that anti-Catholicism has actually played into Catholicism's favor. Let me give you three reasons. The first is that anti-Catholicism has to misrepresent Catholicism. So for a lot of young Protestants, including myself, who were taught growing up, falsehoods about the Catholic Church, misrepresentations and distortions of Catholicism, things like they worship Mary, you can get stuck in purgatory. They believe you have to pay for salvation. They believe that you don't need grace, that it's just by your works that you're saved. I mean, just all these crazy misrepresentations of Catholicism. For those Protestants who are a bit more inquisitive, who are a bit more critical, who are willing to go to the primary text and give the other side a fair shake, a lot of them end up becoming Catholic because they realize, often unintentionally, that their Protestant institutions and ministers and teachers were giving them a fake version of Catholicism, a caricature of the real thing. On the flip side, if anti Catholicism is dropped and Protestants try to give Catholicism a more fair hearing, you end up finding that people still end up converting. It reminds me of what Bishop Frank J. Caggiano of the Diocese of Bridgeport said, and I work for Bishop Caggiano as the director of apologetics. Bishop Caggiano says, our faith is inherently convincing, right? Our faith is inherently convincing. If you give Catholicism a fair hearing, people will convert. It reminds me how Fulton Sheen, he once said that there aren't like 100 people in America who really hate Catholicism. There's more likely people who hate a misrepresentation, a caricature of what Catholicism actually is. So anti-Catholicism plays into Catholicism's favor because anti-Catholicism causes more critical Protestants to actually look into Catholicism and realize that they've been, told lies about the faith their entire lives. Or if you try to give a more fair representation of Catholicism, people convert anyway because the faith is inherently convincing. All right, the second way that anti-Catholicism plays into Catholicism's hand, it's that anti-Catholicism has produced among Protestants a disdain towards high church things. Things like, a more structured liturgy, more repetitive meditative prayer, a more structured liturgical calendar. What ends up happening is that for low church Protestants, they end up becoming suspicious of high church Protestants, or if their friends, go into a high church Lutheran or even an Anglican church. I have a friend of mine who I'll leave unnamed who has to face this stigma from his own Protestant peers, and he himself is a Protestant who just so happens to like high church things and the incense and, the bells and the whistles and other things. So it's interesting that, the disdain for Catholicism has caused a disdain for high church features that seem too Catholic. It's like, we now in the Protestant mind, it seems, so to speak, Catholics own the high church stuff. But then on the flip side, we now know that there are young people, a decent number, who want more high church things, who want sacraments and sacramentology and something a bit more structured in that way. And so when Protestant pastors and theologians try to come back and say, oh, well, no, Protestantism can also have high church stuff, it just comes off like when your parents say, we have McDonald's at home, right? And it just ends up being the low budget version. Because anti-Catholicism has made high church stuff, uh, synonymous with Catholicism, and now there are more young people interested in high church things. It's like the damage has already been done. People are going to come into the Catholic Church if they're interested in high church things. Obviously, that's a bit of a oversimplification, but I think it's pretty fair in terms of general trends that we're seeing. So, the third and final way that anti Catholicism plays into Catholicism's hand is that Protestantism is not really an organic or natural development. Now, this is going to be a bit more controversial, but so much of Protestantism is a reaction to Catholicism, whereas Catholicism, I mean, it's been around, I would argue, since the first century, and all the things that we have in the church, like the canon law, the very sophisticated and often people complain complicated dogmas and doctrines and the whole system of the theology of our faith. I mean, that was born out from the lived experience and history of the church. And so it makes perfectly good sense why, for example, we wouldn't just have the Bible, but we would also have an infallible interpretive authority to help us make sense of the Bible. Because historically, in the experience of the church, it wasn't just biblical interpretation that solved things. We needed to have councils and institutions that were divinely given to us to help us deal with these problems. It makes total sense that we would have apostolic tradition to help us make sense of what the faith is. Whereas Protestantism, by cutting off a lot of these things and avoiding them, just in the name of not being Catholic, right? So think about like sola scriptura and other Protestant distinctives. Those things don't come off really as intuitive if we were doing like an a priori analysis. Given the fact that human beings are rational, political, and social animals, it wouldn't make sense that God would give us an inerrant text, but then just leave us with fallible authorities. If God could, it seems like he would have every good reason, right, to give us also an infallible interpretive authority to protect and make sense of the inerrant scriptures. I like to view the magisterium as the living arms of the Bible. I mean, that's really what it is, to help make sense of what's going on with the sacred text. And so in reality, then, Protestantism ends up really looking like a product of the 16th century, of the late Middle Ages and early modernity. It doesn't really come off as what you would naturally expect given the history and the trek and the voyage of the church throughout the centuries. So those are three ways in which I think anti-Catholicism has played into Catholicism's hand.